So thanks again, everyone. I think we've just got most of our people on board now. So I'll move straight to Robert and introduce Robert. Thank you, Robert. So we have Robert with us, and Robert is right for this minute the New South Wales Commissioner for Ageing and Disability, but has recently been appointed as the Commissioner of the Australian Human Rights Commission in the role of the Age Discrimination Commissioner. So congratulations, Robert. We know how much you have worked in this space as a Commissioner for the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, but also your work across so many organisations, many of them who are in the Catholic space. You know, your work with the St Vincent de Paul Society and the chair of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, and of course you were the chair of Catholic Social Services Australia and the chair of Caritas. So you do really understand our space, and we're so pleased and honoured to have you here today, and look forward very much to your presentation and the engagement in a really vibrant conversation. So over to you now, Robert. Thank you.
Good. Thanks so much, Ursula. And it's a tremendous joy to be with so many of you. And even the faces that I can see, I know a number of you. So it's great to be here. Let me also just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which is the Barramatical people here in Parramatta. They've been associated with the Parramatta River for over 60,000 years. And in just referencing that, I've often referenced the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And there's a lovely expression in there, a really powerful one, that whilst it talks about the litany of problems within Indigenous communities, it then says that nothing can be resolved unless we deal with the torment of the powerless. That torment of the powerless is an expression which is really powerful to me, and it speaks to me in the work that we do. In many senses, it also speaks to the work we're about to talk about. People with disability and older people often find themselves in circumstances where they become invisible. In fact, the one thing I know about you and I is at some stage we will feel that we've become invisible. The worst thing, however, is we become voiceless. Others take over, telling us how we'll live our lives, what's good for us, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. Many of those will do that with good intent, but some won't. And in many senses, we are dealing in this space with the sense of powerlessness. It's also true with children. It's also true with spouses and partners that are subject to domestic and family violence. It's true in so many areas of abuse that it is about a sense of powerlessness on one hand and a sense of domination by others. The good news about today is all about self-interest. We're all about to get older. I'm older, and some of you are older than me. Not many, but some of you. And the one thing that's going to happen. The second thing is many of us will experience the disability as we do get older. Some of us may have had disabilities as we were in children or throughout our lives. But the one sure thing is the longer we live, then in fact we are more likely than not to ourselves have disability. So in one sense, this is a topic that's easy to talk about because it's about you and I. It's about those that live with us in our communities or those that live with us in our families and homes. On the other hand, it's a really difficult topic because we as Australians don't really want to believe that the abuse of older people and the abuse of people with disability is as significant as it really is. That's true with all abuse. We didn't want to believe that parents would abuse and sexually abuse their children. We certainly didn't want to believe that trusted teachers, religious members of our community more generally would abuse children in our institutions. And for a long time, we really didn't want to believe that the abuse of women in relationships was as severe as it was. But we've come to a recognition of the truth of that fact, that in fact abuse does exist for children, for partners and in institutions. But in Australia, we're still at the very beginning of realising that abuse of people with disability and abuse of older people is real. So just before we start the slide show, which is only a few slides, a couple of statistics which I think are always helpful. The Royal Commission into Aged Care had some really alarming figures. In 2019 to 2020, that's a while ago, in residential care, there were 5,700 allegations of assault in our aged care facilities. That's 4 years ago. And that was only assault by staff and volunteers. It was estimated by KPMG that somewhere between 27 and 39,000, big range, were assaulted by fellow residents. So just in residential aged care. A recent survey in relation to retirement villages by the Retirement Villages Residents Association of New South Wales had an alarming figure which showed that 75% of residents in retirement villages believe that they have been psychologically abused in the last year. Now, putting aside that number, what was even more staggering was the vast majority of that abuse was resident on resident. Fellow residents in retirement villages exercising undue pressure, influence, harassment of residents in care. And then the prevalence study that was done by the Australian government through the Australian Institute of Family Studies just a couple of years ago showed that 15% of all older Australians believe that they have been subject to abuse in the last year. Now, that prevalence study, 15%, is higher than I thought it would be. We'd always assumed it could have been around 5, 6, 7%. But even if that's inaccurate by a few degrees, it still means that an enormous number of older people believe they've been abused in the last year. In the New South Wales context, for example, that's 190,000 older people. So abuse in that space, of course, is largely by family members, which we'll talk about later. The vast majority of abuse of older people in our community is, of course, by their adult sons and daughters. And that's the work that we do in the Ageing and Disability Commission. 2/3 of all of the matters we deal with as statutory reports are abuse by family members. And then over and above that, another 10 or 12% are by partners and spouses. You look at the space with disability, we've always known that disability has been an area where there has been some abuse. For a long time, people with disability lived in our institutions, some of them run by church, many of them run by governments. And today, of course, they're under the NDIS scheme. But I think that what the Royal Commission into Disability showed was the high level of abuse more generally. Just a couple of figures about that. According to the ABS, more than half of people with disability aged 18 to 64, which is that particular cohort, had experienced physical or sexual violence in their lives. Half of adult people with disability. And physical assault was the most common form of violence or abuse. And that was experienced by about 45% of people with disability compared to in the general community, which is just under 30%. So again, we're talking about very large numbers. The numbers themselves are not there to scare, but they are to say that for any institution at all, for governments of all persuasions, and for us as a community, these are serious issues. So it's very important and I'm very grateful that ACSL has put this on as such an important topic. The other thing I just want to say before we go through the slides is that, of course, it's not only about how we protect those that we care for, our clients, our residents, those we provide services to. It's also about how we protect ourselves. For many aging religious, they will enter in these aged care facilities. What's the safeguarding for brothers, sisters, priests that are entering those communities? And so it's not just about how we safeguard others, it's about how we safeguard ourselves. And one of the things that's really important to understand is the very last line of defense against abuse is the person themselves. So even with children, that's true. That's not to say in any circumstances is the child, the person with a disability, the older person in any way responsible for the abuse that occurs. But an abuser has to go through many, many barriers before they actually abuse. And the very last one is us, ourselves, our children and ourselves. So part of this is about how do you protect and safeguard yourself, as well as institutions and organisations, how you protect others. As the Catholic Church becomes more and more involved in health services, aged care services, alternative living arrangements, care for people with disabilities, these become more significant and more focused. But it's also just the last point, it's about our parishes as well. Much of the abuse takes place by other church members. Our organisation here deals with that. We've had lots of examples where a parishioner in a particular parish is abused by a fellow parishioner. They build up a level of trust in relation to those. And of course, over time, if there is ill intent, they become carers, and then ultimately they start off by being supportive and helpful, but ultimately turn into being people that abuse. So our parish communities and our church communities are not places where we are abuse-free. We know that in relation to children, and we should know that in relation to vulnerable adults generally. So another layer to all this is not just the facilities we run, but the very church communities we operate in. And again, I don't think we've paid much attention to that because we really don't want to believe that occurs. Our work here over the last 5 years, where we receive about 14,000 calls to the helpline and about 4,200 turn into statutory reports, shows that that's not the case. It's not particular to Catholic Church, it's across all areas and it's across all cultures as well. So we might just put the slideshow up. There's not many slides, but they might help us in our thinking through this, and then there'll be lots of time for questions. I just want to start with a very Catholic thing, and that's the Benedictine statement. Saint Benedict in the 6th century said this, that listen with the ear of your heart. Why that is so important is that this is a space in which you can form opinions very quickly. And your heart can be quite hardened. We saw that in the response to child abuse. And there are some in the church today that deny the truth of what was revealed. They simply won't accept. In a sense, they're hard-hearted and they have no capacity to listen to the truth of what was exposed. They believe that by denying it, blaming others, somehow or another it diminishes the truth of what occurred, but it doesn't. The converse to that is so many in the church were and are able to listen with their heart to what is being told. And when we're dealing with victims and survivors, this is so important. So I just want to start with that premise that the way in which we approach all of these topics with an openness, a sense of compassion, I think is articulated in that very simple expression that St. Benedict gave to us more than, centuries ago. The next slide is to try to put this in the Catholic context. Sister Liz Hoskin was giving a presentation to a board that I'm on. I'm on board of a non-profit organisation which is owned by a large number of religious congregations. And one of the formations, she said this, respect for the dignity of the human person is the bedrock of all Catholic social ethics. Each person reveals something of God's self. There are no spare or disposable people. There were no spare or disposable children. And yet the truth of the matter is that abuse only occurs where there is no respect, no dignity. No child has ever been abused because they've been held with respect and dignity. No woman has ever been abused in marriage or in relationships because their partner respected them and treated them with dignity. No older person and no person with a disability is ever abused because they have been respected. The truth is, it is all about the lack of respect. And with the lack of respect, the lack of dignity, comes the lack of power or the imposition of control by others. So for us, this is just core. Our foundations for our abuse, our entry into safeguarding is based on this very simple notion. But it has real meaning in the works that you do. Do you respect the people that we serve, the people that we work with? And the answer to that is not always, because we could not possibly have the level of abuse we have in aged care or disability services if respect was fundamental to the organisations where I've operated. I don't doubt for one moment every one of you will have a mission statement that says this. Every one of you will have a value statement that says about respect and dignity. But the truth of the matter is that only has meaning if the behaviours of yourself, the boards, the staff, and other people actually to put that in practice. And so what we see in institutions that are value-based, such as the Catholic Church, is that the values are not, in fact, aligned to the way in which people behave and treat others. And that's a very big issue in healthcare, and it's a very big issue in aged care as well. The mere fact that you've got a mission statement, the mere fact that you've got a value statement is in itself not sufficient unless you've got a culture which requires the behaviours of everyone to be aligned to that. And in abuse, that's critical. The next slide. So there are three things that underline a safe institution. I'll come to some more in a moment, but there's three. And if we remember nothing else that's today, it's dignity, that is respect and rights. So dignity is not about just a notion. It is actually now based on rights as well. And in the areas that you're working in for people with disability and for older people, rights are becoming more and more entrenched. For people with disability, of course, there's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, to which Australia is a signatory. So all people with disability, irrespective of age, whether they've had a disability as a child or they've acquired a disability in their 80s, have certain rights. Strangely enough, older people don't. Older people do not have a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People, but they have rights absolutely. And the new aged care legislation, as is the NDIS legislation, is all based on rights. The second is agency, and this is so critical. It's the voice and choice of older people. Before I said that older people often become invisible and voiceless. And one of the things that we're moving to is a recognition that all people, people with disability and older people, have voice. And often that's talked about as choice and control in the NDIS system and in the aged care system. The challenge for you is, how do you hear the voice? How do you recognise the choices and the control of older people and people with disabilities? And there's a profound problem here for older people, and that is the minute they get a diagnosis of dementia. When you get a diagnosis of dementia, a couple of things we now know. The first thing is you should become more active, not less. Previously, we used to say, oh, well, that's the end of you. You've got to be quiet and, sit in a chair and do nothing. That's in fact completely perverse to good well-being for a person with dementia. But the second is you do not lose capacity but it fades over time. So one of the dangers is that relatives and providers, the minute someone gets dementia or some other condition of a similar nature where there's cognitive decline, they immediately assume the person has no capacity. That is simply not the case. So we spend an enormous amount of effort working with families, carers, and agencies, I might say, trying to get them to understand that a person that has dementia or cognitive decline still is capable of making choices in relation to a whole range of issues. And it's an obligation of the service to give agency to that person. And that's often by different means, giving tools and techniques, I'll come back to later, to enable that voice to be heard. But it is tragic and shocking that the minute somebody gets diagnosed with cognitive decline, everyone around them assumes they have no voice. It might take at least 10 years to lose capacity if you've got a prognosis or a diagnosis of dementia. And the last one is really important. It's about relationships that are safe and healthy. A couple of things are really worrying in the Australian context. We've got this notion that everybody wants to die at home. It's aging in place, it's called, and it's a fine notion. Every survey shows that everybody wants to age in place. But that's only a sensible approach is if the accommodation, the house you've got, is safe and affordable, and for many it's not. It's about whether or not you're able to access services and supports in a safe and healthy way. And the third one is you're able to maintain relationships within the community. The notion that we want to age in place as isolated, lonely, depressed older people is a ridiculous notion in social policy. And so far, this sort of mantra is leading to a situation where we believe that aging in place means just what it says. My view is it doesn't mean that at all. It has to be it has to be a place where you can be healthy, and it has to be a place where we have relationships. And the challenge here is about right relationships. After the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, priests used to say to me endlessly, I can't go into a school playground. I can't have a relationship with children. People would say to me in other organisations, in sporting clubs and that, no, we can no longer have these relationships with the children. That was not true. What was always about is not having relationships. It was about having right relationships. And they are based on safe and healthy principles. And that doesn't matter whether you're in an aged care facility or you're either in a retirement village or whether you're in disability service. relationships are those things that keep us going. One of the tragedies, however, is that in relation to aged care, a vast number of people living in aged care receive no visitors at all. Their relationships are entirely between the staff and themselves. That's an extraordinarily odd phenomenon. It's not one that's experienced in any other part of the world. For reasons which are incomprehensible to me at the moment, we have a society where placing people into aged care may be the absolute right thing, and the quality of that care may be very good. But for some reasons, families and others drift away. And so in many of our facilities, we don't have those relationships except within the facility itself. For safeguarding, that's a huge risk. That's an enormous risk. Who is more likely to be abused in a residential care service? Is it the one that's going to have visitors, families connected, coming and going, asking questions, advocating to the staff, or is it likely to be somebody that's much more isolated than that? And I think you can answer that. For people with disability and disability homes, I think there's a different set of factors. But again, the same thing applies. Who external to the staff have the relationship with people with disabilities? So I don't think these, for anyone that's been around social justice issues, these would come as any surprise to you. But they are the core to safeguarding, as they are to care and well-being. So just the next slide. So the types of abuse we're talking about are psychological abuse, which is generally got elements of coercive control in that. It's where somebody takes control of your decision-making. In relation to older people, that's the most dominant form of abuse, but it's very often associated with others. Physical abuse, which is actually an assault, is the Royal Commission said that's the most common form of abuse in aged care. But in the community, it's generally the third one down, but that doesn't matter. It's physical abuse by anybody at all, whether it's staff or family or friends. Financial abuse is a growing problem in Australia, a significant problem for older people particularly. It wasn't a problem for people with disabilities, although people used to steal the disability support pension. But now, because of NDIS, there is now money through the NDIS, and so financial abuse is increasing for people with disabilities in a way that we had not previously seen. For older people, the problem here is a couple of things. It's not only that there are more older people who are entering risk areas, that's about 75 to 85 years of age, where you become more frail, more dependent, and some of us lose cognitive ability. So therefore, the chance of abuse is higher anyway. But the other problem that's happening is that my children's generation now have to wait much longer for the transfer of wealth through inheritance. And the one thing we now know about Australian adult children is they are not patient. And so what's happening is a societal shift that the longer the next generation has to wait for the wealth to be transferred to them, the increasing impatience will grow and the much more likelihood we will see of financial abuse. And that is certainly a growing issue right throughout Australia. It can also happen by people that hold your power of attorney. Increasingly, attorneys are abusers of the system. And it's not a huge percentage of our work, but it's an increasing percentage of our work. And there's many examples of that. So often in financial abuse, the attorney will start to act well in advance of when they should. They'll start to buy small items for themselves. They'll generally then buy a car for themselves on the pretext that that's needed to take the older person, to health services, even though that might only be once a month. And then they'll start to ramp up the level of financial abuse. Just recently, there's a court case going on at the moment, which came through our office. The daughter of an elderly couple stopped spending money on her parents, and allegedly, by the time we got involved, had taken $900,000 from her parents. In another case, it was the son of an elderly mother. He was a problem gambler. By the time we became involved, he had taken about $160,000 from his mother. So they're big amounts, but often it can be very small amounts, or it can be millions of dollars. Sexual abuse is increasing. The sexual abuse of older women is on the rise. It's not clear exactly why that's occurring. It's not, I don't want to alarm people, it's not a huge percentage, about 5% of the work we do, but sexual abuse of women in residential care is being reported more. So I don't want to say that it's actually rising in aged care. It's just being reported more. Neglect is a huge problem in Australian society because it's an insidious problem of abuse. Here, often it starts with the carer being taking responsibility. And in some cultural communities, there's an expectation that the older son or the older daughter will suddenly become the carer. Often they do not have the capacity to care. And the rest of the family will say, well, we're supporting that carer. We respect our elderly. What we find is that's not true at all. What they're doing is they're telling the daughter what to do, but they're not actually helping you to do anything. And in many senses, neglect starts when the carer no longer is capable of caring. Or the other one is where they're actually not allowing the older person to spend money. They refuse to allow the person to access their social networks. They refuse to allow their person to spend money on clothing. They won't let them go and see health professionals. And the longer the abuse goes on, the neglect goes on, the less likely is that they will actually have home care or any other form of care. So the older person goes into a state of neglect. Ultimately, they're hospitalised, and we get quite a lot of referrals from hospitals where the person has entered the healthcare system because of years and years of neglect. Often, as I say, it's because the carer becomes incapable, but is unable to or unwilling to call in the help that's necessary. Or alternatively, they refuse to allow money to be spent, and that's called inheritance maintenance, where you, in fact, stop the person spending your inheritance. So you don't steal it, you just won't let them have it. That's a very difficult area, but it will ultimately end in hospitalisation and ultimately in death if it's not rectified. The difficulty there is, whilst the police are much more active in relation to this issue, the chances of getting a conviction are very low because the principal witness, that is the older person, has either lost capacity or is now dead. And the second thing is courts and juries don't want to believe that relatives would allow their mother or father to die of neglect. And so it's counterintuitive to our belief system, but the truth is it's there. And the last one is outright exploitation, and that's increasing, where older people and people with disabilities are being targeted by people who have only one motivation, and that is to defraud them. That can happen by them weeding their way into somebody's life and becoming a carer. They can often be appointed as a power of attorney, and they can often end up living with that person. And a number of the examples we've seen through religious settings, that's exactly what occurs. The person becomes the friend, the carer, the living supporter, and ultimately the abuser. In a recent case in a retirement village, a woman who was a resident in a retirement village was highly exploited by another male resident in that same village. And that's exactly what happened. He befriended her, became carer, didn't move in. He was living a couple of doors down. And at the time we were called in, he'd taken $360,000 from her. So those cases are one of genuine exploitation. So we'll just go on. One of the things I just want to chat about is community attitudes and social attitudes. You remember with children, the context in which abuse occurs and is responded to is contextual. So when we were doing the Royal Commission on into institutional child sexual abuse, we were looking at the community attitudes that gave rise to that. And they're just some of them there. There was a view that children were less valued and respected than others. And we reduced our investment in their safety because of that. The court system themselves had a policy that children were not to be believed vis-a-vis the evidence of an adult. And that was in place as a young lawyer. It was also true that women were not to be given as much credibility vis-a-vis evidence by a male. And that was also in place when I was a young lawyer. So not only did society treat children poorly, the legal system didn't believe them in the absence of an adult. You just think about that in the case of sexual abuse, where there's only two people, the child and the adult. And our legal system, together with our institutions, such as the Catholic Church, came very quickly to the view that the child should not be believed. in the absence of a collaborative evidence. Tolerance and perpetration of intimidation, bullying, violence was fairly prevalent. Bullying was very prevalent in many of the Catholic schools and other places. Social taboos, and stigmatization, particularly in relation to teenage boys who were abused, and the notion that they were homosexual or something like that was a huge problem. Shame in relation to cold and ethnic communities. What would happen there is if a child from an Orthodox family, a cold family, would disclose the abuse, the parents would immediately say, "We don't believe you." Why would you believe your child? Extraordinary, isn't it? But then they would say, "But even if you're true, you're going to bring shame on the family, shame on the church, shame on the community and the culture. And by the way, he's a really good bloke and he wouldn't have done it anyway." But shame is the same that exists in a community in relation to elder abuse, and I'll come to that. And then there were barriers, really a whole lot of barriers in relation to people actually coming forward. So here, this one is actually about barriers in relation to potential perpetrators. Where would you go if you were a young man, young boy, a teenager, who had a predilection to having sex with a child? Where in our society can you go to get help? Not many places. So there were community attitudes. The next slide. There were societal attitudes. And so when you're looking at abuse, there's a history to this. The reason why abuse in the church and other institutions is so well talked about in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, USA, and so on, is because we have an increasing belief in the rights of children. But we didn't. And the bringing forward of sexual abuse claims only occurs in an environment where children's rights are respected. So a lot of the church in other countries, Africa, South America, and so on, deny that there is sexual abuse in their church. That's not true. We know it. But in the context where their own communities, their societies don't give voice to children, it's probably not an understandable position, as untruthful as it is, because coming forward in relation to abuse requires the community to also be open to it. You'll also see there with children, it was about sexual interactions were seen as, with adults, were seen as complicit or culpable. They wanted it in somehow or another. They enjoyed it in somehow. It was part of a loving relationship, all of which is not true, but that persisted in the minds of some. And even today, you'll hear very intelligent but ill-informed people make those accusations. As soon as a victim comes forward, they will immediately turn it back on the victim themselves. And that, unfortunately, will remain with us, but not by people in your position. And they weren't believed. So the question here is, the next slide, is what do you think are some of the community and societal attitudes that could affect our response to the abuse of vulnerable adults? So given there's so many of you, I was going to pause at this time and take questions, and also just some thoughts about that. But Ursula, I'm not quite sure the best way to do that, or do you want me just to continue on until the end?
Thank you, Robert. That's so far, I think people are just really engaged with what you've been saying. But I do think it's an opportunity for questions. If anyone has questions of Robert, can you put your name in the chat and we'll call you so that you can actually reach out to Robert and ask your question now.
And then I'll come back and do the rest of the slides and open it up.
Lovely. Give you a break from talking. I had a question, if we can start with that, please, Robert. And that is, in the conversations that we've had so far in your presentation, the notion of personal agency is a really important one. And the issue that we've come across, I guess, in some respects, is where people say, for example, in the prison system, that people, you have given up your rights to actually report and make allegations about abuse. And it's some of the issues that have emerged in the redress scheme, just it kind of bring those things to light, especially for the evidence around abuse allegations. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how that works for those people who have less agency or less capacity to have a voice.
There's nothing whatsoever that removes your right to disclose abuse because you're in prison. There's simply nothing that does that other than the practices that we impose. The conditions in which people are in prison mitigates against them coming forward in the first place of making those allegations generally, because of fear of retribution within the system itself, particularly in relation to sexual abuse as a child. The Royal Commission visited 104 correctional services, conducted private sessions in 50, and I did over 500 prisoners who spoke to me about their sexual abuse as a child, their entry into out-of-home care, juvenile justice, and then their criminal offending. A number of those were multiple murderers, rapists, child sexual abusers themselves, and others. But Ursula, everybody has the right to be able to come forward in relation to that matter. The issue for prisoners where they've committed very grievous offences is, I suppose, a public policy issue. And that's all it is. And it's also a political issue. Would the community deem it acceptable for a person with serious offences to be compensated through a redress scheme? And that's the issue. But it's not, but that's a political issue and it's a social public policy issue. My view was that the redress scheme should, and I believe it now does, allow for people that have been incarcerated to come forward to seek redress. What I'm not sure about is whether or not there is some conditionality on that at the moment. I'm just not sure about that. But mere imprisonment doesn't take away the rights. The second thing to understand is the vast majority of prisoners have been abused, particularly sexual offending visitors. Now, in no way does what happened to you as a child or a young person or in your 20s provide the excuse for the crimes that you commit. And no one is suggesting that. But it's completely irresponsible to say that what happened to someone as a child and as a young person has no bearing on what then took place as adults. And in the private sessions that I did, many of them had never disclosed their child sexual abuse at all, ever. Most of them had never used it in a court case to get a reduced sentence. The mythology out there, if you talk to prison guards and others, is, they all use sexual offence to get a reduction in sentencing. That's simply not true. That is completely not true. That's a mythology. They will not disclose sexual abuse. They will disclose physical and other abuse by their parents and others. Sexual abuse, very rare. Sometimes it does come up for very clear reasons. So the third thing that happened in those private sessions were people suddenly connected. They hadn't thought about what had happened to them as a child and what they're offending later in life. They hadn't connected. And suddenly in the middle of the private session, they were connected. And it was an extraordinary moment, I've got to tell you. So all of that says, Ursula, a long way. You don't extinguish your rights to be able to come forward in relation to the abuse that has existed previously or currently just because you're in prison. And the only reasons we do that is because we allow it to happen or there are political public policy reasons for that. The other thing too is 90% of prisoners come out of jail anyway. Every single year, every single year, Australia releases 37,000 prisoners every year. You know, the media is worried about 100 people from detention centres for refugees that have had criminal pasts. We release 37,000 people every year from prison. So they are going to come back into our community. And if they don't have the capacity to be able to talk about their experiences, then in fact they will be less likely to stay in the community than they are to return to prison. So the more we can support them, the better. Sorry about the long-winded nature of that, Ursula.
Thank you very much, Robert. Now, we have got some questions in the chat. So first of all, Helen has just asked, and of course we all fall for this in the sense that we use so many acronyms. She's asked if you can explain what COLD stands for.
Yeah, so COLD used to be the non-English speaking background term. Then we turned it into culturally and linguistically diverse. And now we talk about them as culturally diverse communities. With excluding Indigenous from that space, which I do, it's people where their first language is likely to be a language other than Australian, or they have a cultural connection to a migrant or ethnic background. And that group, and of course, that's a very, very, very big part of the Australian society. The problem in that space, which I talk about later, is that the cultural taboos in those communities significantly impact on not only the occurrence of abuse in some cases, but most importantly, about coming forward. There are really strong barriers for the disclosure of abuse in some of those spiritual and cultural and ethnic communities, which we need to address. And if you're a provider, it's a very significant issue to come to.
Great, thanks, Robert. Jane's asked a question here. How can concerns around abuse be managed if the person being abused is denying the abuse due to fear?
So we deal with that all the time. So the jurisdiction here in the Aging Disability Commission is what's called a will and preference jurisdiction. So that means I'm by law required to take into account the wishes and preferences of older people and people with disability. Contrast that to child protection. Child protection is a best interest jurisdiction. Decision makers in child protection must act in the best interest of the child. They must have regard to the child's wishes, but ultimately they act in the best interests of children. My jurisdiction, and in aging and disability, it's actually not a best interests. It's trying to take into account their views and wishes. Second thing is, for me to do an investigation, I have to get their consent. This is quite a high order. So if I said to a woman, let's assume this for a moment, which is a very close example, young Johnny, her son, 50-year-old son, is abusing her, both stealing the money and physically attacking her. I once went into a family where I was in my 20s working as a volunteer with St. Vincent de Paul Society, and just shortly before I'd got there, the son had threatened with a screwdriver to puncture his mother in order to get the money. She gave him the money, he left. She was living on charity while he was stealing the money, but he was physically violent to her. Nobody would have reported that at that stage. Today, of course, that sort of offence is more likely to be recorded. So the thing there is about it. If we say to somebody, do you want us to investigate Johnny? She will say to me, Johnny, I want Johnny to stop doing what he's doing to me. She won't say it's abuse. She'll say, I want him to stop hurting me. I want him to stop stealing my money. Then she'll say, well, but deep down, Johnny's not a bad boy, is he? And then she'll say, and Johnny's the only one in the family that cares. He comes around, nobody else does. And then she'll say, well, we don't want Johnny to get into trouble with the police. And then the last one is, if Johnny gets into trouble with the police, who's going to care for me? So that's the environment we meet every single day. Because most of the abuse we deal with, 66% by your children or siblings, we use a progressive approach. We say, would you like us to look at what sort of services we could bring in? Would you like us to look at whether or not you're losing money from your bank account? Oh, yes, we'd like that. And then we come to the point and we say, we think it's so serious that an investigation is warranted. Would you like us to do it? And 90% of the time they'll say yes at that point. However, if they choose to say no, we don't consent to the investigation, and they have capacity, that is, they understand what is occurring to them, they understand the consequences of what's occurring to them, then subject to a determination of risk, we will respect that decision not to investigate. Now, that means the next day, if that person is assaulted or killed, I'll wear that blame. But you can't believe in will and preference unless you actually acknowledge their right to make that decision. So in this jurisdiction, you live with the fact that we are not trying to create risk-free environments. I can't do that for myself, let alone for you. No agency can create a risk-free environment for anyone. But what we can do is try to minimise the risk. But at the end of the day, if the person has the capacity to understand what is happening and the consequences of that, which is a big test, then we will try to respect those wishes. And if we don't do that, then we're not giving agency to older people or people with disabilities. Can I override it? Yes, I can. Do we override it occasionally? But if you believe in will and preference, voice and choice, you've got to do that, which means leaving people with some risk.
Well, that is an interesting segue into the next question from Patty, which takes us into the issue of coercive control. So Patty asks, can you comment on the problem of coercive control in religious groups, which have an unhealthy view of obedience and hierarchical authority?
Well, Patty, you like to get me into trouble. religious communities, let me go back. So what I'm about to say may not be your lived experience as religious brothers or nuns or even priests, but it is a truth. A lot of the formation processes that took place in relation to the entry of young women and young men into postulates and novitiates and so on, the system itself was abusive in nature and designed to be so. It was about the unmaking of the civilian and turning them into the warrior Christian. They had to be something different. It's exactly what happens in the military. And exactly what happens in the military, where you break them down and rebuild them, was what religious life was all about. The loss of personal identity, the loss of personal agency in the greater good. Today, we would regard many of those practices as systemic abuse, and religious themselves know that, even if they came through relatively unscarred. The second thing was it gave a tolerance for abuse. So in many of the religious orders, they tolerated corporal punishment of children in a way that society itself found totally unacceptable. It allowed for the abuse of children within orphanages, boys and girls' homes in a way that would not have been tolerated in any other part of society. And so in many senses, coercive control, the loss of agency, was part of the formation of religious and some priests. It's also true in other religions, not just the Catholics. So let me be clear, this is not a Catholic thing. It's happened in many other areas as well. It happens around the world in some of the unreformed seminaries and houses of formation in some of the congregations today in some parts of the world. If that is part of your formation, whether you see it as abuse or not, it doesn't actually matter. What happens is it creates a really unhealthy culture inside. And what we saw in a number of the religious orders was bullying within the order itself. And by the order, a number of the schools have principals who today would be regarded as outright, almost sociopathic bullies. And they existed. They may exist today in some parts, but they existed. So my friends in the Christian Brothers is an example. I have a very close relationship with Christian Brothers. I was taught by Christian Brothers in 2 schools. My sons went to Christian Brothers. I have a high regard for the order, despite the level of abuse in that. What I've said to the Christian Brothers who tolerate me is I can accept that they may not have known about the sexual abuse that was occurring. But what they did know is that they had a large number of members who acted in a way to children that was completely and utterly unacceptable. And that's what we saw in prisons, in juvenile justice centres, in out-of-home facilities, in disability homes. Even if people didn't know about the actual abuse, the environment was one in which other forms of what we now regard as abuse is critical. So the real challenge for every one of us in our family life, in our community life, in our religious life, in the services, is to really give people agency. And that starts with the people that run the services. The way in which the board operates, the way in which the councils of the congregation run, the way in which we treat each other as staff, is fundamental to whether or not you will have a safe environment. If there's bullying, harassment, intolerance inside the boards, inside the provincial councils, inside the orders, inside the institutions, why do you think staff will suddenly have a totally different view of the world and be sweetness and goodness? So the expression, the fish rots from the head, is very true around abuse. So the job of safeguarding is not just to have a whole lot of procedures and policies, which we'll come to in a moment. It's actually to have a culture that is authentic from the very top to the very bottom. And giving agencies is important. A second thing just to be very in mind is a lot of people that enter religious lives were themselves abused. Not most, a tiny percentage, but some. The failure to recognise that many enter religious life having come from family abuse, significant abuse, including sexual abuse, was never recognised and never talked about and still isn't. But the denial of that means that those women and men live their whole lives with this dark secret. And we know now that anyone being forced to do that, it will be very, very impactful on them. And we have learned that over time. So just on another area, the recognition that within our own ranks are people that were abused is important in terms of allowing these issues to be dealt with with some integrity and authority. But going back to Paddy's point, agency is incredibly important within the institutional framework, including religious members, as well as boards and staff generally.
Thanks, Robert. I think that we might keep moving on if that's okay. We're halfway throughout your presentation, so thank you for those responses.
So safe communities are what are also important. I won't go much about this. There's a very big movement in relation to older people to create what we call age-friendly societies, age-friendly communities. There's work being done, for example, in the Hunter Valley in Newcastle in relation to this. The view here is unless we have safe communities, then it's very hard to eradicate abuse within institutions and agencies generally. So for us, the question is, how do we shape societies for people with disability and older people that make communities safe? The report from the Royal Commission into People with Disabilities looked at public safety of people with disabilities. And it's the first time that's really happened. And a lot of the recommendations from that are about how do we create a safer environment for people with disability to live in the community. The Dementia Australia has a campaign about dementia-friendly communities. So my point of just raising this is a lot of the work that you and I are engaged in is trying to improve organisational safety. But our task is made that much harder if the society around us is not safe for them. And for people with disability, it's a profound problem because people assume that they're safe, but they don't see themselves as being safe. The other thing just to bear in mind with people with disabilities, the vast majority of people with disability acquire disability in old age. So whilst when you talk about people with disabilities, we're largely talking about children and people under the age of 65, many of whom are on NDS. Older people constitute the largest group of people with disability. So this issue about safe communities, I think, is an emerging issue, and it's about building knowledge and capacity in the communities. So you'll see more and more of this talk about age-friendly communities, disability-friendly communities, dementia-friendly communities, and we should be participants in that dialogue. Next one. So the Royal Commission looked at safe institutions, and I just adapted it for this. If you said to me, what is a safe institution, aged care, retirement village, disability service, parish, it's basically is where we create cultures and adopt strategies and take action to prevent harm. It's pretty simple as a statement, but that's what it's about. Cultures, strategies, and action. If you only have the first bit, not the last two, you won't get anywhere. And conversely, if you don't have the right culture, you might as well give up today. So a possible definition is where there's consciously and systemically conditions that reduce the likelihood of harm, create conditions that increase the likelihood of identifying and reporting harm, and then responding to disclosures, allegations, and suspicions. So very importantly in safeguarding, and today I'm not going through policies and procedures, Ursula and others have got those, it is this. In your institution, what are you doing to reduce the likelihood of harm? That does include workers' checks for vulnerable, for those working with vulnerable people, children's checks and so on. It's about the way in which you induct people. It's around the way in which you enculturate the policies, the mission, the values, and so on. But it's also a physicality. So, for example, the removal of having children in locked confessional boxes, which is not being done in many of the conservative parishes, is a simple safeguarding procedure. The fact that now that no music room in any school will be a solid door, it will always have a glass panel in them, is simply about reducing the likelihood of harm. So there are physical things you do, which you may or may not think are relevant, but they are, to reduce harms. The introduction of cameras in certain passageways in certain residential institutions is important. So there are physical things you do to reduce the likelihood of harm. The second thing is getting staff to identify and report what may be issues of concern. So with children, we didn't understand grooming. If we'd understood grooming a long time ago, a lot of the abuse we saw would have probably not happened. Today, teachers and staff in educational facilities are very attentive to signs that something's not right, grooming, for example. Less so in health services and probably less so in aged care services, but in disability services, it is there. The problem here is resident-on-resident abuse, which I'll talk about later. What's appropriate behaviours and what's not. But between staff and vulnerable people, it's about that. And the last one is, what do you do when you have disclosures, allegations, suspicions of harms? And I want you just to think about this. In Australia, when I was growing up and as a young lawyer, we expected that people would go to work and be injured and die. It was part of the acceptance of workplaces. And then there was this enormous cultural shift when legislation was introduced by states and territories and the Commonwealth. The business community said, we'll all go broke. You know, business community always say that. That's their mantra. We'll all go broke. Every time government does anything, we're all going to go broke. Today, there's not a workplace in Australia that has any common decency that doesn't automatically act in a way where we try to make the workplace safe. We accept the workplace health and safety regime. We might think it's too onerous. Some people think it's too legalistic. But we now expect to go to work and come home without injury and death. And we're shocked when it is otherwise. It's the same with safety. If you want to think about it as a board, as an institution, just think of it as another element of workplace health and safety, because every institution is a workplace. Every institution is a workplace. So just think of it in that. And when people go weak at the knees around safeguarding, just say, well, you know, we live very well with workplace health and safety. And until we actually think of it like that, we'll fail. Whilst ever it's a special item, whenever it's an item that we have to talk about secretly, we'll fail. But in the case of protecting older people and people with disabilities from all sorts of abuse, it's just logical. So I just want you to think about it in those terms. I actually think it is part of it. Others don't, but it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. We want cultures, safe institutions, safe workplaces, just like we do with health and safety. And I think if you think of it in those terms, our job becomes a lot easier. But at the end of the day, you've got to do the three things above it. Reduce the likelihood, create conditions that increase identifying and reporting, and then you've got to respond. The reporting and responding is still a problem, particularly in some institutions and particularly in some ethnic communities. So we have a long way to go in relation to those areas in some parts of our society. Next slide. It is absolutely embedded in institutional leadership, governance and culture. So in the child safe space, there are now mandatory child safe standards that apply to churches. Say, for example, in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, applies to parishes, it applies to schools, it applies to all sorts of facilities where you interact with children. One of the very first one of that is this one. It's about leaders, governance and culture. And if you look at it, one of the ways forward is the fourth one, is by making sure we have codes of conduct that set out clear behavioural standards. This is really important. Volunteers and staff, clerics and religious, are all obligated to codes of conduct in the way in which they provide services, including parish services. And why the code is so important, it's an instrument which allows you as a leader to take action. A code of conduct is such an important document, and without it, you will find dealing with this issue, particularly if you observe poor conduct, very difficult. So it has a number of elements to it, but the first one is that you as governors accept it. So the next slide. And then just a couple of quick reminders. Be open to the possibility that it may be true. In the child protection area, the problem is people said it couldn't be true. When X was alleged to have been abused a child, people who knew them, other religious who worked and lived with them would say, oh, it can't be true. As a leader, you have to say there's a possibility that it is true. Because if you don't do that, you will lead the next process, the investigation, down a very dangerous path. You don't have to believe that it's true, but you have to believe that it is the possibility that it is true that a staff member has physically or sexually abused a resident. You have to be open to the possibility that it's true. And that's hard because many of us don't want to believe the possibility that it's true. The second one is your opinion doesn't matter, but your judgment does. In relation to many forms of abuse, but particularly sexual abuse, is we immediately form a judgment. And there are 4 ways you'll do it. The first is he couldn't possibly have done it. He's a wonderful person. I've known him all my life. I went through school. I went through the seminary with him. He couldn't possibly have done it. Second one is, I'm not sure about that, but she's always making up stories. You know, she's always coming on to men. She's not trustworthy. So you blame the victim. Third one is, I'm not sure. Only a minority of us have that view. And the fourth one is, I saw him do something at the Christmas party and I think he's as guilty as hell. Now, that applies in elder abuse and abuse of people with disabilities as well. The minute you do that, you will fix that view and you won't change it. So sexual abuse particularly is the one crime where nobody changes their mind. If you think he's innocent, doesn't matter if he gets found guilty, you'll still believe it. If you believe he's guilty, but he's found innocent, you'll still believe it. Less so in elder abuse and less so in people with disabilities, but it's actually true. So in this space, your opinion you can hold, but you've just got to let the policies and procedures become your friends. Now, isn't that boring? Isn't that utterly boring? But it's true. I never thought in all my life I would ever say policies and procedures should become your friends, but it's true. Because the minute you allow your opinion to dictate what you do, you'll muck it up. You'll muck it up absolutely. And that's what we saw over and over and over again by well-meaning leaders in this child sexual abuse, but we see it in people that run aged care, retirement villages, disability services. They form an opinion, and from that moment on, there was a CEO of a disability service that was before the Royal Commission, and there was ample evidence of abuse in that facility, lots of it. The Royal Commission, she, to the very dying moment of her testimony, refused to accept that it is possible that there could have been abuse in her facility. When she was leaving the courtroom, she told her people in earshot of ours what a wonderful evidence she had given. Of course, the final report was damning in its findings. But I think she actually did believe it. I think she had convinced herself it was impossible, and all the evidence, which was considerable, couldn't sway her. And as a consequence, she made very bad decisions. The third thing is, I didn't know won't save you anymore. So in relation to abuse, generally of older people with disabilities, whilst it's not mandatory reporting, like in child protection, if you did know and didn't do anything about it, you can be held to account because you have a duty of care. And if you breach that duty of care at common law, you're liable. Some cases, it will be because you've criminally failed to report something you should have. But if you get up and say to somebody, well, I didn't know, but you never asked, it won't save you. Not so much more so in relation to things. And the last one, just be guided by fairness and compassion in dealing with the complaint. And that includes to the person that's alleged to have done it. Not all allegations end up being substantiated. Not all allegations are true. So therefore, you owe a duty of care to the person that's been accused, and you owe a duty of care to the person that's been alleged to have been abused. And often, irrespective of the outcome, both people will need pastoral care and support to be able to continue in their lives. So be very careful here. Whilst you have a duty of care to the most vulnerable, you also have a duty of care to your staff and other people. And the processes do have to be fair, and pastoral support is critically important as you go through those processes for everyone. And again, your view doesn't matter. Doesn't matter whether you think he or she did it or didn't do it. Next ones, and then we'll open up for questions. So just a couple more. For people with disabilities, just a couple of things to understand is if you've got running a service under NDIS, there are now multiple rights and standards that apply, and there are serious incident reporting regimes that now apply compulsorily. So most of the abuse that I've talked about, especially if it's done by staff and volunteers, will in fact be part of a serious incident reporting regime. And that regime now applies to aged care residential and to home care services. So that regime, I'm talking about NDIS, I'll go back. in the NDIS system, that applies absolutely to any service provider providing services pursuant to the NDIS scheme. And whether that's in a residential service, such as a group home, or it's delivery of home services, or it's delivering of business services, these will apply to you. So in the disability space, if you're part of the NDIS, there are very, very clear standards, requirements, and reporting regimes in place in relation to most of the forms of abuse I've indicated, if it is conducted by staff or volunteers. Where it's by another resident, that may be reportable. If it's by family members, so the child or the adult is in your service, but the abuse is by a family member, then that's actually reportable to agencies such as the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission, or the Adult Safeguarding Unit in Adelaide, or the Adult Safeguarding Unit in Canberra. Other states don't have those. So this is if it's by staff or volunteers under the NDS, very clear. If it's by resident against resident, you've just got to check the standard as to what of those incidents are reportable. In relation to abuse in your service but by other people, then in some states and territories like New South Wales, it's reportable to us. It's not compulsory at this stage to report it to us, but that's the case. I go to the aged one. It's very similar. There is here, I've got a number of issues, but I'll go to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. Same thing. This governs both aged care residential and home care. So again, there are serious incident reporting, which will pick up abuse in the way that I've described. It will not pick up abuse by family members. So if you're running a home care service for older people and you observe that the brother, the sister, the mother, the father, the son or daughter are abusing an older person, that will not be reportable other than to agencies such as ourselves. It only picks up abuse by staff and volunteers in those services. The point that I make here is in the area of older people, in the area of people with disabilities, there are now very clear standards and obligations as service providers. What is clear in both of these, however, is there is a right to the person having that voice that I talked about, agency. I can just go on. I think I'm almost there. Culturally diverse communities. I just want to raise this issue with you. It's about shame. Abuse is not seen as the same as we may see it in non-ethnic communities. In some communities, there is no word for the word abuse. But what is clear is that we need to work with those communities, especially if they're your residents. And abuse in any cultural setting is wrong. The challenge there is the shame that I referred to previously. So communities have enormous problems with the issue of shame. So the first thing I want to say is organisations like myself, there's an expression I heard the other day by a Muslim woman who's been involved in domestic violence, and she said, we have to move from naming and shaming to naming and changing. And that's our job. Our job is to change what is occurring in those communities in relation to abuse. But you do have to do with the issue of shame. And the point that I would make here is, and I address communities often about this, is I can't stop you having shame. But shame can't be a barrier for dealing with the abuse that's occurring. So I can't say to anybody, don't feel shame. If you want to feel shame, you'll feel it. Maybe if I was working with you for 5 years, we'd change it, but it's not going to happen that way. So what we've got to be very careful is never, ever can we say, well, the shame is a reason why we'll allow a child, an older person, a person with disability continue to be harmed or to respond to that harm. And that's the solid conversation you've got. It's a bit like dealing with exceptionally conservative groups in schools who don't want their children to learn about sex. You can't stop sexual abuse unless you talk about sex. And no principal in Australia can in fact not teach sex education despite the views of the devout minority. It's not possible. Similarly, in this space, it is not possible to deal with elder abuse or abuse with people with disabilities if you don't talk about it. So we work with spiritual and cultural leaders in New South Wales to give them permission to do 4 things. The first is the permission for them to understand, a willingness for them to understand the issue. The second is permission for their communities to talk about it. The third is permission for people to come forward and talk to them about it. And the last is permission for their communities to report it. Now, we are a long way short of doing that in many of the communities, and hence only about 8% of our work is in relation to cultural communities. Aboriginal communities are different again, and I won't talk about those now, but they are quite different in relation to disability, abuse of disability, and of course the very big issue there is about the presumption that they treat elders well, but they're also abusing elders, their sons and daughters. And so how do you have that conversation in the context of this overwhelming sentiment that we treat elders well? And yet we see evidence that that's not always the case. Next one. And then last, being very Catholic here, we need an engaged community of knowledge and action. So one of the things in an institution setting, whether it's an aged care facility or a disability service, is that there's a community of knowledge by staff, by board members, staff, volunteers, parents, carers, and others. So like workplace health and safety, it's not a hidden issue. And so you do need to talk about abuse. You can't say, oh, we've got standards and they're hidden away and they're locked in a cupboard. You do have to actually talk about a safe institution. Just like we do in aged care facilities, we talk about reducing the risk of falls. We do need to talk about the risk of abuse. Now, if you look at the Royal Commission figures, this is a no-brainer, but we're terribly timid of it. So we've got to do that. Second one is we do have to commit in our Catholic communities of love and compassion, which are really embracing that notion of dignity and respect for the reasons I've indicated. And the last, we have to make sure in our decision-making that we put the best interests of people with disability and old people paramount. And this is particularly for governance. Institutions have multiple and complex stakeholders and multiple and complex competing demands. What didn't save children was the fact that many institutions didn't preference the interests of children above the institution itself at the time of the abuse or later on. Same in the institutions for older people and people with disabilities. We have to make sure that our services, the decisions we make in relation to people that we're caring for, are placing their best interests. And just lastly on that, goes taking the point that was raised in the questions, and this also applies in relation to those of you and I that will end up in these facilities. We need to have people around us who are advocating for our best interests. And as I said to you, in aged care, the problem is if nobody is connected to these older people, that's a problem. And so when religious go into retirement villages or into aged care, or any of us go into those, there is a real issue about safeguarding of their interests in a really meaningful and intimate way. So I just put that up. So we've got time for some questions. And then there's some other issues if you don't want to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Robert. So much food for thought there. I do have a question that's been texted to me from someone who's obviously trying to watch and can't do both things at once. And that question is around, he says, can you elaborate on the issue of advanced care plans and the intervention by family to override the wishes of the person?
Yes. So this depends on the state and territory again, but advanced care plans are very important. In some jurisdictions, there's moves legislatively to make them mandatory, that the institution must in fact follow them. In other areas, they're seen as simply guidance. So this is not a clear picture. Eventually, I think legislation will be introduced around Australia, which gives legal weight to advanced care directives. I think that's a move that will happen because ultimately it's the agency of the individual that matters. What advanced care directives cannot deal with is voluntary assisted dying or suicide in other terms. But I think, Ursula, that will increasingly be legalised and you'll have to follow them. But right at the moment, that's not necessarily the case as I understand it, and it is a state and territory responsibility. There are very significant issues around the whole range of documents, powers of attorney, enduring powers of attorney, enduring guardianships, and advanced care directives in place. And there's a lot of work being done to try to make that a much more streamlined approach. And we don't have enough time to deal with that. So very importantly, the instruments that are in place are complex, not understood by people, and sometimes abused by the people that have that power. But what all of those documents is trying to provide agency to the person as and when they will need it. And that includes when they lose capacity. But I think we will see a lot of reform in that area over time. But advanced care directives, let me be very clear, is giving agency to the older person or the person with disability or the person who's in significant ill health, and they should be respected, is my point, unless there is exceptional circumstances to override them. And your opinion is not one of those exceptional circumstances. But right at the moment, the problem is that the aged care facilities in particular become very nervous and don't want to get into a fight between the family. And what they normally do is they capitulate to the loudest family member, which is in fact a denial of the agency of the person that's most affected, the person that's dying.
Mm. Thank you, Robert. So now a question that kind of takes the counter view is that knowing that family engagement is such a key protective factor, how can care institutions encourage that co-responsibility of families?
One of the things that in my legislation, I have 4 or 5 rights that I have to give expression to. And one of those is the importance of family and family connectedness. So your question is spot on. For me, it's actually a legislative requirement that we have to look at the importance of the family. So in the work that we do, where it's about family abuse, we immediately start to work with other family members to try to change the relationships. Sometimes it's the relationships of care, sometimes it's legal relationships. So the family is still absolutely involved, but is actually part of the protective mechanism. The second thing is the vast majority of calls we get to our helpline are from other family members who are concerned about what their brother or sister are doing. So we actually attract that very sense of care. What people don't know is what to deal with it, how to deal with that.
Mm.
The third thing is that family members have a bit of an illusion about how much they care for older people. Everyone talks about caring for their parents, everyone talks about caring for the elderly, but actually in practice, what does that really mean? And so one of the things we've got to go through is that if you really care, you will start to take an interest in what's happening to an older person, whether it's in an aged care facility or whether it's in the community more generally. The difficulty in the aged care setting is that how does a aged care facility deal with multiple family members who have different views? And so what's happening, and this is a real problem, is up until now there's been a notion of a nominee, that one family member is the nominee and the agency will only deal with that nominee. A number of aged care facilities are now requiring the resident to have a formal guardian appointed before they will admit the person into the aged care. Now that's outrageous. Like, that is completely outrageous, because that immediately assumes the person has no capacity, no agency. And they're doing it simply for administrative ease, so that they can be certain that Fred or Mary is the person they deal with. So that's clogging up the guardianship tribunals, and it's imposing a requirement that should not be there. But the general notion, how important is the family, absolutely important. But if you're a provider, you do have to be given a means by which you can deal with those issues, especially where there is a multiplicity of families with different views. So my view is, what is a practical way to give agency to the individual? Where that is not the case, where the agency is diminishing capacity, how do you work with the family? The challenge is, how do you do that in a way that makes sense without going to this very extreme position of forcing older people to always have a guardian before you even admit them into aged care. I just think that's a very dangerous and unnecessary practice that's emerging.
Mm. Thanks, Robert. We've got a few more questions here. The first one is, the Federal Disability Act and regulations are changing to cover non-NDIS providers. How do you think that will impact on the non-NDIS providers? That's a question from Joe.
Non-NDIS providers are covered by the Universal Convention on the Rights of Children, the rights of people with disability. And a lot of the service systems are rights-based. So I'm not sure whether they will have a big impact or not. The Royal Commission was very much in favour of creating a new National Rights Act for people with disability. They believe that it will significantly change the way in which systems are designed and systems are operated outside of the NDIS system. I suspect it's right, but I don't want to disagree with the recommendation. I'm not as confident it will lead to a significant change as people believe. What will make a big difference is the states and territory government reinvesting in the care and the provision of services for people with disabilities outside the NDIS. That will make a huge difference. So when the NDIS was created, states and territory governments effectively withdrew from providing supports for people with disabilities outside of the NDIS. The assumption, wrongly, was that the NDIS would pick up some of those early intervention supports. The NDIS review and the work by Bill Shorten, the Minister, is clear that the states now have to re-enter that space and provide much more support for people with disability generally in the community. And I think that will be the real game changer. I'm not opposed at all to a rights bill. I'm just not as sure as it will be as influential as I think it could be. But what will be influential is if the states start to provide better supports for people with disability outside NDIS. And the vast majority of people with disability are not in NDIS. The vast majority of people with disabilities are outside that system.
Thanks, Robert. So now Jane reminded us that you said you'd talk later about the management of residents assaulting residents. Can you offer any advice in this area to them?
So one of the issues, I think, you have a duty of care, and part of that duty of care is to ensure that residents are free of violence or abuse by other residents. And so I think this is an issue where you now need to look at safeguarding differently. I think most institutions here on this line would have well covered through your own work and the work of Ursula and others, abuse by staff and volunteers, that includes religious and others, and clients. I think the unmistaken one is about resident-on-resident abuse. So you need to do a risk assessment about that, or include that in your risk assessment. What is the likelihood that this could occur? What are the physical things that we could do to reduce those risks? What's the information we need to provide to staff, carers, family, and residents with capacity about that? Have we got mechanisms in place where that can be reported? Now, that's a particularly difficult area in this space because you'll immediately have family members and others involved. So my view is I think we're at the stage of being attentive to the fact that it's existing. It will probably increase, and therefore, just like we do in every other area of abuse, a sort of a risk management process in the ways that I've described. But the first point is start to recognise there is a risk, to start to have that common knowledge and understanding, and then again in every other area, what are the things you can do to try to minimise it? You will not be able to eliminate it. The second thing is some of the abuse is occurring because of the nature of the condition a person has. So some of dementia, particularly Lewy body dementia, changes the personality of the person dramatically. But part of the side effect of that is that some men become much more sexually active. And it's a direct consequence of the actual dementia condition. So some of the sexual abuse you're seeing in aged care is because of the condition itself. It's not the natural predilection of the individual. And so you do have to be attentive to the fact that some of the conditions actually do have unusual side effects, and that's one of them. The second is some of the conditions have the side effect of increasing the level of physical violence. And third one is people that have suffered trauma previously or have suffered severe mental health problems. Some of those conditions will be re-triggered by being in residential care, and they will act out. So it sounds a bit terrible, doesn't it? But the truth of the matter is some of those conditions which have been well managed reoccur with some strength later on in life, particularly in a residential environment. So again, as a provider, you've got to be open to that. You've got to have thought it through. You've got to look at conduct that might minimise that. But the older we get, the longer we're living, the more some of those conditions will become apparent, and they really become apparent in residential. In disability homes, disability acting out, sexually acting out violence is part of doing business in disability services. Most services are pretty calm. but from time to time they're not. That's well understood. Any disability provider that pretends there's not sexual or physical violence that could occur in those facilities shouldn't be in the business. And we have enough history to be able to manage those within reason. Again, not a risk-free environment, but.
Thank you so much, Robert. We've come to the end of our time, and you've given us so much information and support in our work. So thank you very much for that. Please, on behalf of us all, please give Robert an online clap for that. It was really very, very helpful. Robert, can I just say thank you again for what has been a really inspiring conversation this morning, and can we wish you great luck and perseverance with your new role as the new Commonwealth Ageing Commissioner, and great strength to your arm. We know that it's been a wonderful appointment. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ursula. It's a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.